Hello, my name is Michael P. Coleman. I'm content director for Brother Be Well, and I want to welcome you to the platform today. We're looking forward to this conversation, or I have been for quite some time. We're going to talk about the stigma that's unfortunately still associated with people of color communities in this country. And we're joined today with a really all-star cast of folks that are going to help us unpack this question, this issue. First up, help me welcome them, if you will. First up, we've got Sheree Criner. Sheree is a registered nurse and vice president of the Capital City Black Nurses Association. Hi, Sheree, how are you doing?
Thank you so much for having me.
Really good to see you again. Looking forward to our talk. Next up, Julio Cruz. He's a Brother Be Well clinical advisor. He's also an integrated behavioral health provider at Sacramento's Native American Health Center. Julio, how are you, sir?
I am pretty good. How you doing today?
Really good. Really good to see you again. Next up, I get to meet her tonight. I'm excited. Dr. Kristee Haggins. I've heard so much about her. Kristee Haggins is a psychologist, and she's the founder of Safe Black Space. Dr. Haggins, how are you today?
I'm doing great. Thanks. Glad to be here.
Really, really, really good to see you. And then we've got Dr. Hendry Ton, and Dr. Ton is Associate Vice Chancellor for Health Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. He's a clinical professor as well of psychiatry and behavioral sciences at UC Davis Health. And I'm glad I got that mouthful out okay. Dr. Ton, how are you today, sir?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much.
Really looking forward to unpacking this question with everybody. But before we get started, we're going to be led in prayer. And I appreciate you being willing to do that. Julio, why don't you lead us in a moment of prayer, if you would?
Absolutely. Creator, I thank you for the opportunity to share space with people who service the community. We ask you for wisdom, knowledge, courage, and fortitude to carry the message for those who experience despair. We ask you for strength to continue this mission and blessings for those who have nobody to pray for them. Oh.
Amen.
Amen.
I love it, my friend. Thank you very much for that. Thank you very much for that. I may have you in to start each of our conversations with Brother Be Well with something like that, Julio. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Let's get into this. This is going to be, we got a lot to unpack here, so let's get started right away. Let's differentiate first between public stigma and self-stigma, and I think I've got it right. Public stigma involves the negative attitudes that others have about mental health, and self-stigma basically is those of that subset of stuff. That's the stuff that we brought into ourselves. We bought into it ourselves. We've begun to believe those negative impressions that we have about mental health. What stigmatized messages, my question, what stigmatized messages do our communities tell us about mental health, and to what extent have we internalized them? And I don't know, I'm tempted to say, Sheree, you're right on top of my screen now, so maybe we'll start out with Sheree Criner. What are those stigmatized messages, and to what extent have we bought into them from your perspective?
As a nurse, I actually have had the opportunity to talk to a lot of patients about mental health, and oftentimes there are cultural reasons that people feel that there's stigma around mental health based on their own personal beliefs, which falls under the umbrella of self-stigma, and then the public stigma. We've all heard those microaggressive phrases, you're crazy, or we have people that have other cultural beliefs that may not align with some of the things that we now know to be true about mental health and ways to help in those situations. So I think you're always battling both in those situations, and it's a barrier to access because oftentimes it's not even just having a place to go, but having the willpower to pursue it when it's against what you may believe or those around you believe.
Excellent perspective. Before we move on, does anyone else, the first half of this conversation is kind of free flowing before we get into some targeted questions. Anyone have anything they want to add to what Sheree just presented?
I do. Actually, I think that public perception of mental health and the stigma is very much tied to the self-stigma, right? We learn from the messages that we hear when we're growing up and when we start experiencing life. And I think that a lot of the communities of people of color, we hear that mental health weaknesses are not okay. You should be able to be as strong as the people who came before you. Only weak people need help with their emotions. It's something that you don't talk about. And those are like the public messages we hear. That's the cultural perception. And it differs from like one group to another, but in general, especially being a male, I think that we hear that males don't have the right to break down and to look for mental health support, right? So if I ever experience any need or any pain, any discomfort that requires me to look for help, that self-stigma is pretty much attached to the messages I received throughout my life.
Wow. Wow. Wondering about, excellent perspectives there, sir. Wondering about the effects of stigma on both our physical health and our mental health. And originally these were two separate questions, but we got so much to talk about. I combined them. Can we talk about briefly the effects of stigma on our physical health? How does that show up in our bodies? And then what potential mental health pitfalls do we have to deal with when we are combating stigma? Dr. Haggins.
Thank you. I actually will back up a little bit because I did want to speak to the self-stigma and public stigma issue that was brought up.
Mm-hmm.
And just bring some understanding that a number of years ago, there was a California Reducing Disparity Project, the first phase, and they looked at different ethnic and racial communities across the state of California. And when they did their survey around the Black community, part of what came out, and the report title itself was, "We Ain't Crazy, We're Dealing with the Crazy System." And the idea of kind of that interaction between what it means to be crazy, right, and the stigma associated with that, but also this recognition that we are dealing with systemic issues that kind of create challenges for us as Black people. And so I just wanted to kind of name that. I also wanted to speak to what Sheree was bringing up in terms of beliefs, as well as Julio, that part of what can happen in addition to the gender dynamics that he was raising, right? Men aren't supposed to be weak in general. We're not supposed to be weak and have issues and problems, but it can come up in terms of religion, right? Particularly in the Black community. Historically, we may have heard messages around just pray on it, baby, right? That there's not to say that there is not a value in our religious and spiritual beliefs, but there sometimes can be ways in which we don't seek treatment because we may expect other forces to provide that relief for us. So when you asked about some of the physical as well as the mental health implications of stigma and how it may show up, it may mean primarily that people don't seek treatment, whether it be in terms of physical health or mental health. Oftentimes, too, what we see in terms of when people are experiencing psychological issues, they may not go to a therapist or a psychiatrist or a psychologist first. They will go to a physician and or sometimes they'll go to their faith leaders. And so we need to also understand how that may show up in terms of just seeking treatment. And then the last thing I'll say is just understanding that there's this interaction, mind, body, spirit, kind of interaction between all of the things that we experience in our lives. So when we're not getting the help that we may need in one area, it may show up in others.
Excellent perspective. Thank you, Dr. Haggins.